Thank you, Pastor David. Don't you appreciate Pastor David? Good morning, everybody. I hope that you are having a wonderful time. If you're joining us online, I hope it is a lot drier than it is here in Myrtle Beach. It's a little bit cold, damp, and dreary. But I'm excited because we are talking about a topic that is hopefully going to help us to be able to battle against the dreariness seasons of our life. And we're continuing this series called Scramble. And in essence, what we've been talking about is how do we, number one, how do we bring awareness to the moments and the times in which we feel scrambled, where our margin that we have to be able to make wise decisions begins to shrink, and then we feel ourselves not able to get our arms wrapped around our family, our jobs, our resources, whatever it is, we get into those seasons. And so if you remember a couple weeks ago, we talked specifically about, all right, Terry, what happens when we feel scrambled? And if you remember, we used the word, we reminded all of us that the word despair comes from the word disrepair. And that word disrepair speaks to the idea of our mind that when the left and the right side of our brain stop talking to one another, we find ourselves in a state of disrepair. And when that happens, then a couple of things happen. Either one, for some of us, we become illogical. We begin to say things and do things that don't make logical sense. For others, we might lose all emotion or connectivity with any kind of emotion. It's kind of like we feel numb. And we said we got to make sure that we recognize that. Then in week 2, we talked about, all right, Terry, when we get to those places or we see friends that are in those places, how do we begin climbing out of that? And so we started with the 5 ways that we repair what's been disconnected. And so last week we talked about 2 things. First, we said this, that it's really important when someone in our life feels a state of disrepair to show up. Show up in the difficulties. Be there with him. Set healthy boundaries, but make sure that you don't ignore it. Make sure that you show up on a consistent basis for them. And then the second thing we said is to see them. See their hearts. See them for who God made them to be. And to not label them, not shame them, remember? Not ignore them, but to look and know that they are a creation of God. And as a creation God, I should care for and fight for that heart. I'm thankful that we have student leaders that treat all of our students not by their behavior and their actions. How many of you ever taught middle school before? Aren't you glad that we have adults that see beyond the behavior and fight for the heart? And that's really what we talked about in our second point. Today, we're going to finalize these last 3 points, but the way that we're going to do it is by me stop talking. And all God's people said, amen. Now, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to be silent. No, the way that we're going to do this is I have a dear friend of mine, and I want to introduce her. This friend of mine that I met in Fort Lauderdale has a wealth of knowledge as a behavior specialist. She grew up with an amazing family that poured into her, and then she then took it, and she has a wealth of knowledge in this area with regards to parenting techniques. And so she writes specifically parenting. She also communicates about parenting. She speaks directly to behavioral strategies. And so she's going to help us unpack these final 3. So would you welcome to the platform Mrs. Tori Roberts.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to gracefully get on this chair. You're not going to pay attention to me.
There you go.
I think I did it.
Hey, friend.
I did it. Okay.
Glad you're here.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Yes. Well, we're going to have some fun unpacking this, but Tori, I've kind of teed up a little bit of your background, but why don't you tell everyone a little bit about why you're sitting here and why you feel that you can add value to this conversation?
Well, I hope that I can add value.
Yeah.
So I am a behavioral specialist. That is not a licensed mental health therapist or a licensed mental health counselor. What that means is that I worked with children or middle schoolers and high schoolers in a group home setting. So we would have kids that were on the verge of getting trouble, not on the verge, they were getting into trouble, and this was kind of their last step before some serious things happen. So they would come to us, and I would work with them to help them change their behaviors, but then also come alongside their parents to help them have some new parenting techniques and come up with a behavior plan for their family specifically. So that I did that for about 10 years, and then Adam and I, my husband, we moved into the group home as house parents. And then he was a youth pastor during that time. I've worked in the kids ministry at our church in Fort Lauderdale. So we've had lots of, being around kids and teens, which
One of Tori's greatest gifts that I love on our team here as a staff, you don't know this, she works for our church. She's our engagement director, which focuses on our social media presence and platform, but also from a neighborhood group standpoint, connecting all that come into the church with a group. And so if you hear from Tori or if you get a nudge from Tori, you know that she's trying to get you into community. That's part of her job. But I also love that she has the ability to tap into that principle that Jesus spoke of, which is walk another mile in someone else's shoes. She has that gift of empathy, which I love. And so she always challenges me with that because I'm a fixer by nature. Rub some dirt on it and we'll be all right. So she does challenge me in this. Well, Tori, as we kind of jump into this topic, when we hear the term mental health, I kind of feel like everyone in the room, when we hear that term, there's a negativity associated with it. And it doesn't make sense to me because really when you think about it, the word health is a positive word, right? When I say the word health, everyone in here, we're like, oh yeah, that's a good thing. But when I put the word mental before it, it's as if everyone in the room goes, they put an arm up. Whoa, I'm okay. I don't need that. There's a negative connotation with it. And so can you do me a favor as we talk about this? Why is mental health so stigmatized?
Yeah, I love the fact that we talk about it because I feel like the more we talk about it, the less stigmatized it is. But I think that when we think of mental health, we all think of, immediately we go to mental illness. And just like we need to take care of our bodies and our, how we're eating and exercising, I feel like we do need to prioritize taking care of our mental health. Just like you go to the doctor, you get your wellness checks, you go to the dentist a couple times a year to check on the health of your mouth. This is our wellness check for our mental health. Yeah. And I think that if you look at it in that way, it kind of takes the stigma away.
Yeah, a little bit. It's kind of interesting too, and we've talked about this even in the other services, where it's like getting advice or getting support. It's one of those things where many of us in the room, we don't want to admit if we've gone to a counselor or we've gotten counseling as if that's a negative thing. And I want to make it very clear in this room, watching online on the balcony, every single one of you has sought counsel. If you really think about it, you've called mom, you've called dad, you've called friends. Hey, can we go to lunch? Hey, I have something to unpack with you. Hey, I really need some advice. So every single person seeks counsel, but all of a sudden when we say we need counseling, it's like, no, I don't need that. Yes, you do. All of us do. So let's all agree together that counseling is not a bad thing. Counseling is a good thing, and so whether it's mental health or whether in other areas, it's always a good thing to get a fresh perspective moving in. So now it kind of leads me to our second question here is when it comes to our kids, and we're going to really hone in on the family, and family is different today in day and age. The majority of family is not mom, dad, and two biological children. The majority of family today is stepmom, stepdad, guardian, grandparent, stepchild, foster child. There's all different kinds of family units that we have in our country today and around the world. So when it comes to the family unit and kids, what are kids and teens facing today that's different from what I face? You're a lot younger than me, so what I faced at my age.
Actually, we're very close in age.
I know, I was just trying to help you out.
So I actually had to do some research on this because the pandemic, I know we're tired of talking about it, but the pandemic really was difficult for the kids and teens because their entire normalcy changed. They were no longer in school, they were no longer being with their friends, and it was very difficult for them. In fact, statistics were saying between the ages of 12 and 17, the mental health crises, like big deals, rose 31% during the pandemic, that's big. But I think before the pandemic, even before that, our children, because we talked about this earlier, they're never off. They have cell phones, they're always on, their friends can always get them, they can never shut down. Social media is ever pervasive, and I think that they are being forced to grow up faster than any generation because of all the input that they're taking that they're not quite developmentally ready to take.
You mentioned a really, really kind of triggering topic, which is social media and technology and different things. And I know everyone in our country today and around the world, we're battling with it. I kind of feel like, Tori, that many of us, when we look at it, we fall into the same trap that society wants us to, which is it's all or nothing. And I think that's why we struggle having opinions on things, because what we do is when it comes to like technology or social media, we immediately go to, well, I got to either be for it or I got to be against it. And that's not really the case. You don't necessarily have to do that. Case in point, if you're a parent and you have a child that is in school, for instance, and all of a sudden something happens where there's a lockdown, or you see all of a sudden on TV where there's someone that is causing harm or danger to that school, aren't you thankful that your child has a way to be able to communicate with you, to tell them, I'm okay, here's where I'm at, and here's what's happening? We thank God for that. That's a good thing. Like, yes, I'm very, very thankful for that. But at the same token, we also know the negative effects of social media and how we see the suicide rate for teenagers has exploded post-pandemic, because especially teenage girls are looking and they're being bullied in ways in which parents don't even realize because it's on social media. So it's not necessarily an all or nothing, but I know that that kind of leads us into a little bit of the next question. But it kind of leads into recognizing certain things, but understanding what our kids are facing with regards to it. So can you explain, as we look at our kids that are facing this dynamic, that all of a sudden seem to be disengaging from us because we don't understand, or we get mad, or this and that, and it becomes a battle of whether to have a phone, whether to be on social media, and we get so wrapped up into that. But it kind of leads to the idea that they begin to drift from us. So when that happens, we kind of think of a couple of words that I want you to kind of explain to us. Can you explain the difference between something where we notice our kids maybe being anxious or having anxiety, or what are those signs of depression? Like, and how do we tell the difference in that?
And those are actually the top two things that our kids are dealing with as far as mental health goes, is anxiety and depression. And what we do want to make sure that we understand is we can feel anxious. All of us feel anxious. We have something coming up at work. We have a test. We have, dealing with taxes. There's things that make us feel anxious. But anxiety and clinical anxiety is when that is ever pervasive. It's the same thing with depression. We can feel sad. We can feel depressed. I feel like we were laughing this weekend with the weather. It just makes me want to kind of curl up in a ball and just kind of makes me feel sad on the inside. But when that is ever pervasive, that's when we need to start paying attention. And that actually looks different in children and in teens than it does in adults sometimes. Obviously, anxiety presents, as fears, and it presents as stress and anxiousness. But for kids, it also presents as physical ailments. Their stomachs are hurting, or they get headaches. And when we want to wake up as parents is when we're seeing it affect their eating habits and their sleeping habits. And that's the same with depression. With teenagers, it's not as prevalent in children, but depression is huge right now, like we said, in teenagers. With teenagers, it's the same thing. You'll see actually physically impacting them with aches and pains. It affects another area we really want to pay attention to is if you have a kid who's very into a certain thing, like say your son is into basketball, and they talk about basketball, they love playing basketball, they love doing it, and then all of a sudden they stop. That's a wake-up call to us. Something has changed for them. So that's where you kind of want to dig in a little bit. And another thing with depression, the same thing as anxiety, is when you see it affect their eating and sleeping. With depression, it can be overeating or it can be undereating, and the same with sleep. It could be they're sleeping more or they're not sleeping. And with teenagers, it's not the mood swings. We all know that they're moody. I love you guys up in the tech booth. We all know that they have the mood swings just because that's just their time of life and they're dealing with the hormone surges. This is like they withdraw, and you just notice a difference. And I actually asked my son, Ruben, if I could share a story. Sometimes it's hard to even see, and this is something that, obviously I did professionally, but when my son was in 4th grade, he had some school changes, and he had his school merged with another school. So there was a bunch of new kids that came in. They were very different than what he was used to. He had a new teacher. There's several different things, and all of a sudden he started getting stomach aches. So I immediately then go to, okay, are you eating something that's upsetting your stomach? Do we need to look at your diet? What's going on? And then it started getting worse and worse and worse. And it ended up by the end of that school year, he was throwing up before school every morning. So this is a fourth grader. And so that's when I had to be like, okay, this is obviously, we're dealing with something and we need to make some changes. So there's just, it's ever pervasive.
Yeah, I love that. And, that kind of leads into this discussion of how do we repair as, whether it's our children, and how do we begin helping them to repair? And I love, and it really leads to our third way that we can help to repair, and that is to listen. But listening goes beyond just listening to what they're telling you, because isn't it true that our kids and our teenagers and middle schoolers, they don't necessarily know how to communicate what they're going through. And so the way in which they communicate is not necessarily through words, it's actually through, like you said, physical signs. And so when we say listen, listening means leaning into the cues. You mentioned the basketball illustration. Noticing when their likes or their dislikes change on a dime. And sometimes we're guilty of just saying, oh, well, that's just what it is. That's just being a teenager. But sometimes I think we might miss something bigger that's happening by just dismissing it as just a season of life. And so leaning in a little bit and listening to those cues really leads to that third position. Well, as we talk about that, I think that leads, and I think that question just popped up, but it's one thing to listen for the cues and one thing to understand those cues. It's another thing to understand how to deal with them. So what are some of the strategies to help our kids and teenagers to be able to battle anxiety and depression?
So these, I feel like these are kind of warning signs, and we need to treat them like you would a fever in a child, where you don't maybe understand why the fever is happening, but you know that you need to deal with it. That means your body's fighting something. So when we start seeing some of these behaviors, it's the same thing for our mental health. So one of the things that Adam and I always talk about, my husband always talk about, is that we as parents and grandparents are the gatekeepers of our home. We are in charge of what comes into our home. So one of the things that we can do is make sure that the negativity is not coming in. I don't think I've shared yet, but I sometimes struggle with anxiety a little bit. And so I have to make sure that I am leaving that at the door, that I'm not bringing negativity into my house personally. So that's something that I need to do a check on when I'm coming home. Another very simple tip for somebody, a kid that's struggling with anxiety, is we tend to bombard them with questions. They get home and they're like, how was your day? What did you eat? Who did you sit by? Who did you talk to? Did you take your test? How did you do on your test? Did you study for that? And so it instantly is making them tense up. And you usually will then get answers like, fine, good, great, not good. They don't give you anything because they're instantly tense. So one of the things that I personally am working on is not asking questions. It's making statements. It's you know what, I really missed you today. Man, I was praying for you. I remembered that you had a test, and I prayed for you at 12 o'clock when that test was happening. And just letting them know that you're there versus bombarding them. And it feels like that will bring them out, coaxes them out a little bit more. Another thing, I love what you said about listening. We can observe and watch them. There's times when behaviors come out, and it's not about the behavior. It's about what's behind the behavior. So being careful to not take things personally and really reading into what it is, I think.
I had an illustration of that yesterday. I was traveling this weekend for a meeting in Portland, Oregon, and it's funny, I left Myrtle Beach and it was raining, and I landed in Portland, Oregon, and it was foggy and pea soup, and you could see 5 feet in front of your face and raining, and it was all day the next day, and then even the next morning when I flew out from that meeting. And so I landed back, and someone in my family said, how was Portland? And I was like, looked a lot like Myrtle Beach. And just don't know much about it. But when I landed back, it was raining, and I got in the car, and we drove to a restaurant so we can, catch up as a family and have dinner. And my son was standing in front of the door, and so to that point, sometimes, instead of asking, 30 questions, I walked up to him, and I just looked at him, and I hadn't seen him in a while, and I just walked up, and I put my arms open like this, and as I was walking next to him, just to say, I want to give you a hug. And, even at 16, I think something happens when they see an adult be imperative with their emotions. And what I mean by that is that rather than ask them certain things, but just come and say, hey, I'm going to give you a hug. I just miss you. I love you, without even saying anything. And to see him melt in my arms in that moment, like, oh, Dad loves me and Dad missed me. It's a wonderful thing. But really what it speaks to with our kids and our teenagers, I've preached on this before, but every one of us as adults, middle schoolers, teenagers, kids specifically, we have fundamental questions we're constantly wanting answered. And depending on the season of life, we get those answers. And one of the questions we all fight for is do I belong? And if you think about it, if you go to a new job, you want to know if you belong. If you go to and you're at a dinner with friends, you want to know, do I fit in? Do I belong? And it's one of those questions that pops up depending on the season. I was in a meeting with a whole new group of people, and the whole time, should I say something? Should I not? Should I talk? Should I not? It's all about, do I belong? And when I walked up to give Connor a hug, really the reason why I saw him melt in that hug is it's a way for me to answer that question that he's going to continue to have, which is, son, you belong. You belong to me. I'm your father. I love you. I'm proud of you. Without even words spoken, just know that you belong. And so I think for a lot of us as parents that we need to do more of that, like you said, as opposed to 50 questions.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I love is that I feel like God gave us kind of a formula for either when we're battling depression or anxiety in Philippians, and I'm going to read it to you. It says, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your heart and your minds in Christ Jesus. And there's a couple things that have always jumped out at me in these verses. And the first thing is gentleness. And I think as parents and grandparents and people that work with, kids and teenagers, being gentle in our tones is very impactful. It can diffuse difficult situations, just paying attention to how your tone is. Another thing that jumps out at me is prayer. Making sure that we're teaching prayer, when they're dealing with a difficult circumstance at school, or, you're dealing with a difficult circumstance in your family, just making sure to stop and pray. Pastor David used the phrase, prayer brings peace. And I just think that's very true. It gives you an action step when you don't quite know what to do. And the next thing that always sticks out to me is thanksgiving. I know that in my life personally, when I am walking through a journey and I can look back and see the moments that God has moved in my life, it helps me to relax and know, you know what, he's got this, because he did it back then. So if I can be thankful and grateful in the moment, it helps me to remember what God has done. And then the next part of those verses say, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And I'm going to skip to the end. And the God of peace will be with you. And one of the things that my mom always talked to me about when I was a teenager was making sure that you guard your heart and you take captive your thoughts. And I feel like that's what God is speaking to here.
Yeah. I love that. Going back to what you said about the gentleness and tone, I'm going to write that down because that's really hard for Italians. We're just really passionate people, and when we're in our homes, the way that we show love is communication. But when you have a brother who's trying to out-talk you, you just talk over them. That's the way that you get heard, and so it's really tough at times. So I'm going to write that down, gentleness. Okay, I got that. My wife is taking copious notes right now. I can feel it. When it comes to that, I really love what you said about that, though. You mentioned guard the heart, and if you don't know this, in our student area, one of the things that we challenge our small group leaders, and by the way, if you want to pour into the next generation, whether it's kids or whether it's students, we don't need a heartbeat. We don't need someone that has just a little extra time. We need individuals who are ready to work and who are passion-filled and know that they're going to make a difference. This is not a call out for individuals who are like, well, they need more help, I guess I'll try. No, we don't want, I'm sorry, but that's not good enough for my kid. That's not good enough for our kids. We need individuals who have the gift and talent that understand what kids are going through and are willing to help them to navigate and to love on them and to encourage them and to guard their hearts. And so if you're in this room and you have that gift and you actually like kids and teenagers, then I'm going to challenge you, because it's time to stop making excuses, because you're too good to sit. And you have amazing gifts and talents. And this is not in our notes, and she didn't know I was going here, but I just feel the Holy Spirit saying you need to say it. Because you will be blessed. Because we have some pretty amazing kids and teenagers.
Yes.
And you will be filled. You just have to be ready to work hard, because they're struggling through this. But you mentioned guard the heart. How many of you ever had a 3-year-old that when they sat next to you, they couldn't sit still? You ever had that? And what did you used to say to them, right? We said, what do you got, ants in your pants? And you just, and I don't know where that term came from, but, it's kind of funny. It's kind of weird if you think about it. The poor kid, he's got ants in his pants. But I want you to think of the term ant. And you mentioned your mom always talking to you, guard your heart. And I know you kind of lean to that idea of really focusing on what is true and not what maybe the world or others would say. And so really what we're talking about is that we have to capture the thoughts that we allow into our minds. And so when you think of the word ANT, it's an acronym for avoid negative thoughts. So the next time you look at your child or your teenager or even your spouse, one of the ways in which we battle and repair is we have to begin to avoid those negative thoughts. And that really is our fourth way to repair. And the third one is listen. The fourth one is we have to pour in. And the way that we pour in is we have to avoid those negative thoughts when we pour into others. That's why last week we talked about looking past behavior, not shaming, not labeling, but we look at the heart and guard the heart. And so one of the things that we can challenge our child or teenager is that when a negative thought comes, we have to avoid it at all costs. And that kind of leads us to our fifth question, and it's kind of an important one, because we kind of identify, and you've already given us some practical tips and tools, but just from an overall kind of strategy as parents, how can we parent through this season and through this phase when maybe our kids are facing some distress in their life?
Well, and I love that you brought up the youth group and the kids area, because I actually had done some research that jumped out to me, and it's not just parents, it's also the mentors, where they say that these role models and mentors are extremely important. It helps them with social and emotional learning, cognitive learning, and identity formation. That's huge. So I'm very grateful for some of our youth leaders who are sitting over there who pour into my two boys. I'm just very grateful for them. But as for sure. But as you go to parents, I just made a quick checklist because I know we can't spend 2 hours here. So
you don't have time. I mean, you got all the time in the world, right?
I'm personally hungry, so I'm going to move quick.
Okay.
So the first thing to ask yourself as a parent is, do I have a parenting plan? Or am I practicing my parenting plan? What a parenting plan involves is, do I have house rules? Do I have consequences and rewards for when my kids follow or break those rules? Have I set up those boundaries in my house? And the thing a lot of us think when we think of rules and boundaries, that we think negative, but in reality, boundaries make us feel safe. Like if you think about a football game, if there was no boundaries to play within, that would be chaos. So the boundaries make it a safe space for us to be and to play and to live. The second thing is, how busy are we as a family? Do we have time for relationship? If you're too busy, I'm giving you permission to slow down. Have you set time apart where devices are put away, parents included, that you can just focus on relationship? Number 3, do we have a family rhythm? Back in the day, we used to call this a schedule, but we've loosened up a little bit. We call it a rhythm. Do we eat meals at the same time? Do our kids have a wake up and a bedtime? Do we eat dinner together? Do they know what to expect? Do they know what to expect with their day? That's what a family rhythm is. That's another thing that makes them feel safe and secure.
And by the way, one thing I want to add, when Tori talks specifically about family rhythm and eating around the table together, one of the biggest excuses that I hear, and I understand because of sports schedules, multiple kids, running back and forth, this and that, I get it. But the number one reason why couples and families end up in my office seeking counsel is because communication has stopped. And it just makes sense that you've got to fight for your family time, and one of the best ways is around the table. And so I tell parents this, look, even if your food's not even ready, or even if your child has to get out the door early, you can still sit with your child while they eat. You can still form those conversations around the table. So it's time to really put some boundaries and guardrails around those moments.
Yes. And even times in the car, taking advantage of focusing on relationship and prioritizing it. Number 4, do I have appropriate expectations myself for my child? It's so easy to get frustrated with children because we treat them like mini adults versus their brains are still forming. Developmentally, they're still forming. They've done new studies now that tell us that our brains are not fully formed now until about 27, 28 years old.
If you've ever been to college, you know that to be true.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know how the freshman guys revert back to toddlerhood. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
But we need to keep appropriate expectations. When we don't do that, we put too much pressure on our kids. That also makes us take their behavior personally versus having the expectation, nope, my kid's a kid, he's learning, he's gonna break that rule. It's not about me, it's about him learning and developing. And then finally, we need to prioritize our faith. We need to remember that our faith isn't just for Sunday. Our faith is for every day. And when we prioritize our faith, we are giving them the tools to walk through this journey called life. We are reminding them to be grateful for what God has done because we are living that out.
Yeah, I love what you say about prioritizing faith, and I know we've talked throughout the day on part of the reason why I kind of feel that families struggle in prioritizing faith as a family is not because of a lack of desire, it's a lack of know-how. Because isn't it true that what we do sometimes is we compare our family to the best example? And when you compare your family to the best example, and usually it's not actually truth, it's usually what you think you see, and you compare to a picture of what you think you see, and then you measure yourself against that, and you feel as if we're failing as a family. And so what happens when you fail, you don't want to live in that failure, so you avoid that failure. And so then what happens is there's no faith in the home, there's no prioritization because I don't even want to go there because it's a sore subject. And what I would tell you is this, all of us live, and we've learned this as a staff, as a book that we've gone through, all of us live with our own paradigms. And our paradigms are shaped by our history, by our family, by our experiences. We view the prism of many aspects of life through our own paradigm, so faith is one of them. And so as a family, you need to feel the freedom to be unique in prioritizing faith. You are the gatekeepers and the guardhouses to your family's faith. So it doesn't need to look like other individuals' homes. It just needs to follow a rhythm, and it needs to look like what the Holy Spirit and what God is speaking to you. And so I know, share with this group how your kids are different and how you shape prioritizing their faith in conversations at different periods during the day. Because you mentioned at nighttime for one and in the car for another. Would you share that with them?
Sure, absolutely. So both my boys are very different, and if you've got more than one child, you know that. Your kids are never the same. They're totally opposite. So one of my boys loves to talk when he's in the car. When we're in a car ride, this is when he's talking. So we talk about, things that they talk about in youth group, and we apply it to our lives. And then my other son likes to talk at night. So he comes down at night. In fact, I read something yesterday talking about teenagers that want to talk late are no different than a baby that wants to be fed, and we should deal with it at that level of priority, which was very impactful for me.
That's good.
Holy Spirit spoke to me, so I wanted to say that 2 things I always say in every parenting talk is that there's no such thing as a perfect parent. Other than our Heavenly Father. So I want to release you from that. The only thing that we can hope to be is better tomorrow than we were today. There's no such thing as a perfect parent. And then secondly, it's not too late. It is never too late to start doing things within your family. Even if you're a grandparent, it's never too late. We dealt with children that had walked through some very tough and difficult roads, and I had the opportunity to see God work in families, and it was amazing. So those are 2 things I really felt like God told me to tell you.
I love that charge and that challenge, and when you say it's not too late, that really leads to the 5th way that we can repair, and that 5th way is to never give up and to fight. And so to fight for your kids, to fight for your family, to don't throw up the white flag, but just to be able to say, we're going to fight because it matters. And I love it. It leads us to this final passage of Scripture that I know is one of your favorite, one of mine. And so I wanted to share because you know what? Even if you are a mess at home, join the club. We're all messy. But if you're a mess at home, I want this to really impress upon your heart because I love, especially this version that we have, the NIV really speaks to, we still have work that we can start tomorrow. So why don't you share this with them?
So the verse says, it's Proverbs 22:6. It says, start children off on the way they should go, and even when they are old, they will not turn from it. And the thing that I love is if you go back to the original languages, it's not the way they should go, it's the way they are bent. And that's such an amazing thing of hope for all of us, that our children are bent in different directions. They're all different. God made them unique and individual, and that should be hope for us as well. But they will always return to it. Is that right? Well, they will not turn from it. That was what it went away. And I'm like, wait. They will always return to it. So that is such a hope for us that even if our children are bent and kind of going off a path, that's a promise for us as parents.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing with everybody today and the wisdom, the insight, and I think it was valuable for all of us to be able to be encouraged by this. So would you do me a favor and would you thank Mrs. Tori Roberts for her time today?